Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today's is a good one. It has to do with one of the best early spring patterns. We're talking about a pattern that's starting to play in a lot of parts in the country and will over the next month or so, and that is to fish shallow stumps. And I recently got a question from a viewer out there wanting to know how I approach shallow stumps because they live on a lake that has a pile of them. And it's a really good question. So I think there's a couple of things to point out with this. The first is that a shallow stump is not necessarily great if it's just out in the middle of nowhere. A lot of times, the best stumps are going to be set up in the right places. And what I mean by that is if you've got a creek channel or a drain that's on the back of a shallow flat and the stump happens to be on the edge of it, a lot of times that stump is going to be a very good high percentage place versus maybe a shallow stump that's out on a main lake point. Maybe during the summertime that shallow stump's a good place, but in the late winter, early spring, a lot of those shallow stumps that are out on main lake areas are not going to be as good of a high percentage target as they will be further back. Not saying you won't catch fish off of them, but if it were me right now, on a warm late winter day or warming trend during the spring when those fish are starting to push back into areas looking to spawn, I'm going to be looking for shallow flats that are back near spawning areas because those fish are going to pull up next to those stumps and they're going to use them to grab warmth. They're going to use them to bump their eggs if they're big females to break them up a little bit before they spawn. And then the males are going to go ahead and make nests, make the bed right next to those stumps. So you're talking about a period of time over a couple of months where stumps can literally be the home base for not just one fish, but a lot of fish. And that makes them a very good high percentage target. Now, having said that, there's only a handful of baits in my opinion that really work well around stumps. Yes, you can drag any Texas rig. Yes, you can fish a bunch of different baits through them and generate some strikes, but you want a bait that's going to deflect really well off the stump. You want a bait that's not going to get hung up, and you want a bait that's going to generate strikes. So I've got for you 5 baits that I really like to fish around stumps on shallow stump flats. From a location standpoint, I'm looking for stumps that are going to be set up right outside of spawning flats or little pockets. So maybe you've got a couple of secondary points with a couple of small pockets that they spawn in. The stumps could be off those little secondary points. The stumps could be back on shallow flats where you've got a creek channel or that ditch, like I was saying, or it could just be a lone isolated stump by itself that's on a shoreline flat as you go back into a spawning area. Sometimes those isolated stumps are the best places, but a stump as a whole is a great location early in the year because, like I said, it provides warmth. It provides a place during a cold front where they want to sit and stay, and it provides really good bedding areas. So, if you are on a lake that has some stumps, which most lakes around the country do if they're not a natural lake, you're going to have some timber on the bottom and some old stumps. So the first bait that I'm going to be going towards, if it's a shallow flat, let's say I'm fishing a flat that's I'm going to say 3.5 feet of water or less. I'm going to grab for a balsa crankbait like this Bagley Balsa B. This is one of my favorites. I love the old Bagleys. They can get pretty pricey. The new Bagleys are still very good. They make very good high-end balsa baits. So I still do throw quite a bit. This one's a little bit older. It's not a real old one, but this is the original. Maybe you guys can see it. Might be upside down. The original Balsa B is what's on the bottom of this one. You can see I've been using this one. It's got teeth marks. It's got crack marks. I mean, there's a little bit of everything. I've put it through years of use and caught piles of fish on it. So one thing I want to point out with the Balsa that's a key. First, they float generally higher, so they back up better. So when you do bump a stump, they pull away from it and float higher, which prevents a lot of your snags. Also, anytime you're fishing stumps, a square bill or coffin shaped lip is generally going to be better because they deflect better off the stump. If you have a round lipped crankbait, they generally hit the stump and just roll into the object. If you've got that square bill or a coffin shaped lip, they deflect better. So that's going to be a better choice around stumps. So if I'm fishing a shallow flat, I'll go with something like this Balsa Bagley B. It's just one of those baits that works well. The problem with it though is you don't get a lot of diving depth out of it, and that's something that generally happens with balsa crankbaits, just because they're such high floaters. So if I'm fishing a little deeper, maybe I'm fishing some stumps that are in that 6 to 8 foot range, I still really like to go with a crankbait. This is the Berkley Square Bull 7.5. This one runs 6 to 8 feet deep, which is something that I love. It's got a little bit more of that coffin shape lip, but still deflects extremely well. This bait was made to deflect, so that's one of the reasons I like it. Again, it has a relatively good high float, a good reverse up action, which is one of those triggering things. Anytime you're fishing stumps, you want to make contact with the stump. That's one of the best things you can do. If the fish are really actively feeding, they'll eat whatever goes by. If they're not actively feeding, a lot of times the only way to generate that strike is to deflect off that stump, which then gets them to trigger the reaction strike, and you get the fish from that standpoint. So crankbaits, square billed crankbaits are going to be some of my absolute first baits that I'm going to go towards if I'm fishing stumps. Another great choice is a good flipping jig. This is the Luke Clausen Dirty Jigs Compact Pitching Jig. One of my favorites. I want to point out something here. The line tie is one of the main reasons I choose it. You can see the line tie is perpendicular to the hook shank. So because of that, this will come through wood better. And a lot of times when you're fishing stumps, you've got potentially some other branches that are in the area, but you've also got root systems by a lot of those stumps. A lot of times the water has actually eroded out under those stumps, and therefore the bait will go down into the root systems. Well, if you've got a perpendicular line tie, this will come up over those roots better than a parallel line tie. The parallel line tie will act similar to a round bill on a crankbait, meaning it hits and it just rolls into the object. And when it rolls in, the hook is more likely to catch on something and therefore snag. So I like to go with something with a perpendicular line tie. In this case, I've got one of my favorite trailers, just the 3-inch Berkley Pit Boss. Works great on this, one of my favorite combinations. And anytime you're fishing stumps, especially if you're not getting good reaction strikes, a jig is a good bait to throw up to the stump, make contact with the stump, and just let it sit. Dead stake it for a little bit. A lot of times those fish cannot resist that and will eventually pick it up. Next up, we're going with the Berkley Slobber Knocker, guys. Now, this is a bait, I've talked about this a lot. I love this vibrating jig for fishing around wood, and it has to do with the connection point. The connection point does not allow this bait to fully roll over like you will with other vibrating jigs that have your swivel connections. Probably have one here. So you can see this bait can roll much more just based on the connection point. The bar of the Berkley Slobber Knocker prevents it from rolling. And what that means is when it hits, again, you're not going to roll the hook into the bait. So if you're fishing around wood, this is a great way to generate strikes. And a lot of times your stumps on these shallow flats are going to have some scattered grass, some scattered brush. Maybe you've got some emergent grasses like bulrushes or just some various, grasses, hay grass type things. And therefore, a vibrating jig is a great bait to throw. But as soon as you mix in that wood, that's when I really like to go with the slobber knocker and just get that bait to come through and deflect off that wood better than a bunch of other vibrating jigs. The last choice is kind of my backup. It's kind of that, you bring it to the plate just to milk the stump and make sure you haven't left any fish behind. And that's to throw a wacky rigged stick worm. This is the Berkley 5-inch Max Scent the General. One of my favorites. I love this color. This is their purple color. As you can see here, this is just purple, but it's very much of a, almost like an ox bloody color. And I love that. It's one of my favorite colors. But this is just a great bait to throw in there. I've got it on a wacky owner jungle hook, a weedless wacky jungle hook. Great combination here. And this is just one of those things, again, if you think the fish are spawning, so you're going to go from a phase where like your square bill crankbaits and your moving baits are generating more strikes into a period where you're feeling like they're just swatting at it or not necessarily hitting it. And usually when that happens, what that means is the bass have gone from using that stump as a uh, pre-spawn location to a spawning location. So when they start setting up beds on those stumps, that's when throwing your wacky rig is a great presentation. If you can see the stump, you throw it up there and you basically just, again, dead stick it through that area or very slowly move it. And the fish have a really hard time ignoring that. So don't overlook your stumps. Stumps, the best time of year for stumps is going to be late winter into the pre-spawn and spawn period. They can be absolutely phenomenal. They can reload over and over again. They're just one of those bass magnets that can provide you with an opportunity at catching some of the biggest females in the lake that you're fishing. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully it answers the viewer's question. I cannot wait personally to find some stumps to fish in a couple of the upcoming tournaments that I have because I know they're going to be productive. So hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, new video coming out tomorrow.